My name is Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And I want to welcome you to this, our second online discussion on the indictments of former U.S. President Donald Trump. We did our first one last spring after that historic first indictment. It feels like we have had several lifetimes full of news since then, with Trump indicted in 4 different proceedings in state and federal courts, and with a total of 91 criminal charges. There are also civil proceedings against the former president that could wind up damaging his business severely and forcing him to pay possibly extensive damages in a sexual assault case. At the same time, we are meeting a day before the second Republican presidential debate, in which 7 candidates will try to present themselves as alternatives to Trump, even as his lead in the polls continues to grow steadily. Trump himself will not appear in the debate, as he did not in the first GOP face-off. And all of that raises the very large question of what kind of effect Trump's unprecedented legal problems are having on American politics, and how we can explain the powerful hold he has on the Republican Party. I'm very pleased that on short notice, 3 outstanding experts have agreed to join us today, and they will break down some of the facts and implications for us. So please welcome Joyce Vance, Jeffrey Goldberg, and Ryan Goodman. Let me start with Joyce. Joyce is a distinguished professor of the practice of the law at the University of Alabama. She served as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama from 2009 to 2017, which is quite a long tenure. She was nominated for that position by President Barack Obama and unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And as U.S. Attorney, she was responsible for overseeing all federal criminal investigations and prosecutions in northern Alabama, including everything from civil rights to national security to cyber crime to healthcare and corporate fraud. Joyce has served on the Attorney General's Advisory Committee and was the co-chair of its Criminal Practice Subcommittee. She is a very frequent legal commentator on various news shows and on NBC in particular, and MSNBC in particular. And although we don't normally mention such things, her legal analysis has garnered her an extraordinary 1 million followers on the site formerly known as Twitter, which is pretty amazing for a lawyer, I think. Jeff Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, a publication he joined in 2007 as national correspondent. In 2016, he was named that venerable publication's 15th editor in 144 years. In 2022 and 2023, under his leadership, The Atlantic won the National Magazine Award for General Excellence, the highest honor in the magazine world. He has also been the editor-in-chief, as The Atlantic has won the first 3 Pulitzers in its history. He is not only a great editor, but also a great reporter, and so I recommend to you in the current issue of the magazine his outstanding cover story on General Mark Milley, and the extraordinary challenges he faced as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Donald Trump. Where he finds the time, we don't know, but Jeff is also the moderator of Washington Week with The Atlantic, a television show on public television that is also an institution in American media and political life. He is the recipient of awards too numerous to recount, though I'd be remiss if it did not mention that Jeff was a fellow at the American Academy in 2015 and now is a member of our board of trustees. And since he is in some sense one of my bosses, I promise to throw him only softballs. Finally, Ryan Goodman is the Ann and Joel Ehrenkrantz Professor of Law at the New York University School of Law. He is founding co-editor-in-chief of the really superb online national security publication, Just Security. Ryan is also co-director of the Reese Center on Law and Security at NYU, and is professor of politics and professor of sociology at the university. He has also done his turn in government. He was special counsel to the General Counsel of the Department of Defense toward the end of the Obama administration. So we face just a staggering tangle of legal activity going on. Joyce, can I ask you to just run through the major cases as quickly as possible, and so that all of our viewers, especially the ones in Germany who haven't been fully tuned into this, have a sense of this, kind of monster that is on the horizon.
So thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be with all of you this morning, and calling what's going on with the former president a tangle, I think, is only beginning to do it justice. There's a popular Netflix show in America. I'm not sure if you all have it too. It's called Only Murders in the Building, where a group solves a series of murders, and they have a murder board, Bloody Mabel's murder board, with pictures and lines going back and forth, trying to connect everything. I often feel, even though I'm involved in this every day, like I need a murder board here to keep things straight. So let's do the criminal cases. First indicted in New York State by the Manhattan DA, a case that does not involve the presidency. It involves payments that Trump made in advance of the election to a porn star to keep her quiet about their alleged affair. That's number one. Number two, the case that came from out of nowhere. This is a federal prosecution brought in the Southern District of Florida over classified documents that Trump was not entitled to have, but that he kept in his hotel residence in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. He lied to the FBI when they asked for their documents back. Ultimately, they executed a search warrant, and now he's charged with both retaining classified documents and with obstructing the investigation. Number three, the Fulton County, Georgia district attorney gets into the act. In our country, there's concurrent or sometimes overlapping federal criminal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. Fani Willis, who indicted this case, is the elected district attorney for Fulton County, which roughly is a circle around metro Atlanta, Georgia. She charges Trump and a whole cast of others in connection with election interference, mostly cited in Georgia, but with some national feelers. And then we have case number four. That's the federal prosecution brought by a special counsel indicted by the United States Attorney General. That special counsel's name is Jack Smith. He's an experienced prosecutor, and he has indicted only Trump, while including conduct committed by a group of unnamed and unindicted co-conspirators in connection with what we sometimes call here the big lie, or this entire effort by Trump to steal the election. That's the criminal package. Trump has a lot of outstanding civil liability. I'm just going to flag two. The biggest one is a prosecution by New York's Attorney General Tish James, and she is in essence focused on putting Trump's companies out of business, at least in the state of New York. And then a woman named E. Jean Carroll, who has alleged and in her first lawsuit succeeded in convincing a jury that Trump sexually assaulted her in a New York department store. She has a second case going to trial just after the first of the year. The only issue there is how much money Trump will have to pay. The liability has already been determined. So that to say, he's got a busy court calendar coming up for him.
He certainly does. And thank you for doing that so succinctly. Ryan, let me ask you, have the cannons ceased to fire? It seems as though in any number of these cases, there seems to be a possibility of additional charges, perhaps obstruction in some of them, and who knows what else. I mean, Donald Trump tried to buy a pistol yesterday, which is he's also not allowed to do while under criminal indictment. So do you think that this is the end of it? There are also several cases at the state level involving the so-called false electors, which I'll ask you to talk about a bit. Where are we in the unfolding of all this?
So I think we're probably in the third of four laps. I don't think we're done yet. If I were to try to predict or anticipate additional criminal cases or criminal charges, The first basket I would think of are the false electors cases that are starting to potentially pop up in the different states. So Fani Willis in Georgia, one of the pieces that she does in her indictment is to indict a handful of the false electors, the people who on the date that the Electoral College was supposed to meet, December 14th, 2020, entered false certifications saying that they were the rightful electors for the rightful winner of their state, even though Biden had won their state, and then submitted that to state and federal offices. And so she indicts them, and then she also goes up the chain of command and indicts others, including Trump himself, for having orchestrated that plan. But she also maps out, in a certain sense, that this is something that has occurred across the 7 states. And in some sense, it's a template for the other prosecutors in those states if they wanted to move forward. Michigan has already moved forward with all of their false electors being charged by the Michigan authorities, but they stopped short. They did not go up the chain. It's only the Michigan folks themselves. It's not the lawyers surrounding Trump. It's not Giuliani, who it's fairly well alleged orchestrated this. It's not John Eastman or Kenneth Chesebro or Trump himself.
Can you just explain who those people are?
Yeah, so absolutely. So those are private attorneys that were either working with the Trump campaign or allied with Trump himself, nothing to do with him acting in his presidential capacities, in order to try to set up these false electors across the 7 states. The design being that they would then send their false certifications to Congress and to Pence, and that worked perfectly with the scheme, in that Pence would then be pressured to either say, I'm going to suspend the count on January 6th, or I'm going to actually just reject the count from these 7 states. 1 or 2 of those that were the options that they were trying to push on him. But these electors were, at a minimum, the allegation is making false statements and false pretenses to be officials, carrying out their official conduct, when by that point litigation had essentially been exhausted and their governors had certified the election. So the idea is that there are a number of people who are liable in each of the states for having done this. Arizona, I think, is the next place to watch. So it's now known that Arizona does have an active criminal investigation of the false electors in their state. Big open question is whether or not they will do the Michigan model of just charging people in Arizona who were the false electors themselves, or do the Georgia model of then also going up the chain and then maybe going for Trump, and then these 3 private lawyers who are centrally involved in orchestrating the false electors across the 7 states. And then there are other states that seem to not be moving at all, but maybe the game changer is, in some sense, the Georgia indictment and the January 6th indictment from Jack Smith. Pennsylvania, there's Democrats are within the administration, so that you would think there's not bias against following the rule of law in terms of prosecuting. But they said, well, look, in our state, when these individuals entered their false certifications, they had in our state, which they didn't have in the other states except for New Mexico, a specific clause that said this is contingent on litigation being successful. And because they were saying it was contingent on litigation, they don't have as much liability. That's their out. But the reason I suggest that one might think there's a game changer in the indictments that are coming out of Georgia and D.C. is the indictments say, actually, that might be what those people believed on the ground, the false electors themselves, but they were the dupes in the scheme, and the principal organizers like Giuliani and Ken Chesebro knew that the litigation was a pretext. That's the language of Jack Smith. And they knew that they were going to submit their false certifications regardless if they won or lost in litigation, which is what they did. So I think that's one place to watch for. And then the only other one I'd mention, just to be brief, is that there's a lot of reporting that Jack Smith is not done yet. He very well might charge individuals in Trump's orbit for mail or wire fraud, which is using their PAC, Save America PAC, to basically devise a scheme for obtaining money from individual donors under false pretenses. The false pretense might either be the big lie, when these individuals across the board knew that they had lost the election, Trump had lost, but they still raised money on the basis of the big lie, or they raised money but then used it for other purposes, to line pockets and things like that. I'm not sure that one will actually reach Trump himself. The January 6th committee looked into it, and it didn't seem to reach Trump himself, but it could create a whole lot of legal liability for people who might then flip and cooperate in these other investigations.
Okay, a lot more to look forward to. Jeff, how has Donald Trump been reacting lately to his legal difficulties and the continuing torrent of news that casts his administration in a poor light? And this is something that I guess you have been right in the middle of because of your story on General Milley, who was, his appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and whose character he now views differently.
I'd say he's reacted to these set of indictments and charges and all the rest with typical understated maturity that we've come to expect, sobriety, real consciousness of his role in American life and how important it is to be a role model for the young people. So he's what's interesting to me in the context of these trials and what I've seen with Mark Milley just in the past couple of days. I'll give you 20 seconds of background. So I read a long piece about Mark Milley. It's my position that Mark Milley did as much or more than any other individual in or out of government to put it colloquially, keep America on the rails, especially in that period between the election and January 20th, the inauguration of Joe Biden, January 20th, 2021. And it's all laid out in this very long article. And one of the things that's notable about this is that Milley's efforts have been endorsed, and I quote some of these people, by a wide range of current Republican and former Trump administration officials, including John Kelly, the former chief of staff, H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor, one of his many national security advisors, along with Robert Gates, kind of the senior Yoda-like figure of the Republican national security establishment. This all, it's a combination of the actions that Milley took, the way I interpreted them, and also this sort of repudiation of Trump by some of the people who worked for him that caused him to have a sort of, I was going to say it was a typical social media explosion, but it was very untypical. I don't want to read the whole thing. It doesn't really track its sentences, as often these things don't. But he basically implied that a person who's done what General Milley did or alleged to have done should be hanged. That in days of old, the penalty for this would be death, and death was in all capital letters and the usual sort of thing. What was noticeable about this was not so much Trump's reaction. I think I think under the pressure, the legal pressure and other pressures, he's decomposing further, or let's say even more of the filters that whatever filters he had in his mind have stopped working. But what's interesting is that people in my profession treat the fact that the former president of the United States just floated the idea that General Milley should be executed for his actions in and around January 6th, treated it as kind of ho-ho news. That's just Trump. If this happened in another country, if the former president of France called for the death or incited violence against the former French army chief of staff, we would cover this. Our profession would cover this with more alacrity than this has been covered. So to answer your direct question, he's not handling it well. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not even going to play one on Zoom, so I'll leave it to your other esteemed panelists to answer this. But what's interesting legally here to me is that Mark Milley, in at least one, possibly two of these cases, two of the federal cases, certainly, and possibly Georgia as well, is or will be on a witness list. And so what I don't understand is how he could possibly get away with this, calling for violence against America's top general, who may be testifying in his case. In ordinary circumstances, in ordinary times, I assume that this person would be thrown in jail, or at least issued. I don't understand the range of possibilities in front of these judges, but a serious gag order would have to be applied here. So I don't know the answer, but in this case, since this is unprecedented, I think both the judicial system and the media ecosystem are failing to deal with these behaviors in a way that's very, very bad for democracy.
So you bring us to the next really interesting and important topic, and I guess we'll save the failures of the journalism industry for another one. But you know, Jeff makes a really important point that Trump is out there saying truly horrible things about judges, prosecutors. I think he refers to Jack Smith routinely as deranged. He's called the judge in the January 6th case, I believe, an Obama hack. And the prosecutors have legitimate concerns about security. The New York Times had a long article over the weekend about the enormous number of threats that all of these people are getting, really to their physical safety. And we know from a lot of things that have gone on in the US recently, like a guy showing up somewhere in Barack Obama's neighborhood with a gun and an enormous amount of ammunition, that the former president has the ability to kind of activate dangerous people, and without having to send a detailed map and all the rest on how to do things. So the prosecutors have asked for a gag order in the January 6th case, I think the judge faces an enormous dilemma in dealing with someone who is running for president, but whose speech is just completely out of bounds when it comes to the provision of justice. Joyce, how's the judge going to deal with this? What do you think is going to go on? And is moving the trial up one of the options for a judge in a situation like this, moving it forward in the calendar? Why don't you start? I'm sure Joyce will, if her cat there hasn't eaten the cable.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the judge is facing a dilemma. The issue squarely presented to her is a quote unquote narrow gag order. So it's about limiting what Trump can say that would potentially influence the jury pool. That's the way that the government has framed it. But if you actually look at the government's memo, it's broader than that. They are obviously alleging that he is also threatening individual witnesses. And if they had filed that memo today, they would have certainly cited what he just said about General Milley. It fits hand in glove with what their argument is. And I do think that, the first thing that is going to be set up is, does she impose some gag rule? I think she will. Also because I think she's trying to be very careful about letting the criminal justice system operate according to the way in which it's supposed to function, absent the political theater. And at the same time, she has to balance certain First Amendment issues that are more acute in this case, because we're not just dealing with the First Amendment baseline, but rather a candidate for political office who's the front runner of the major party for president. So that's what's happening. But I also think, it kind of dovetails in part with what you had suggested, Daniel, about the first question, like, are we done with the criminal cases? One of the pieces that I think we should keep our eye on the ball is there is a prospect, a possibility. I don't think it's more than 50%, but I think there's a real possibility that the judges in these cases are going to have to face the question of whether or not Donald Trump has violated his conditions of release. In D.C., the condition is very explicit and was impressed upon him at his arraignment hearing, which is you cannot threaten witnesses. You also cannot violate federal or state law. That includes threatening officers of the court like the prosecutor. And it includes federal law like receiving a gun through interstate commerce, which he just apparently may have done this weekend. And if this were the ordinary defendant, they will have violated their conditions for release. And I think they would be much higher than 50% likelihood of facing pretrial imprisonment. So I think that is a way in which our democracy, the American democracy, is going to be tested over the coming months, because Trump's not going to contain himself. Cassidy Hutchinson's book just came out today. How is he possibly going to contain himself? And she's potentially, obviously, a witness in both Georgia.
Cassidy Hutchinson being the former assistant to the former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, in the White House, right?
Yes, with one of the most damaging pieces of congressional testimony in the January 6th committee, now repeated and elaborated on in her book that just came out this morning.
Ryan, if I can follow up on that, don't you think that, part of Donald Trump wants to be thrown in jail, or wants to at least have someone, feel like they've got to throw him in jail, because every bit of evidence that he's being victimized, whether there's any justification for it or not, seems to be helping him in the polls and driving home this argument that he's making in the campaign, that he's being prosecuted because of his base, and that for his base. I mean, it's almost kind of a bizarre, case of Christian sacrifice, that, it's because of them that he is enduring these travails.
Yeah, it's hard to know, in the sense of either he's engaging in this kind of behavior because he knows it strengthens him in a certain sense, and within certain audiences. And it strengthens him in part because it shows that he is bigger than the system, because the system doesn't bring him down. Or it is him engaging in self-destructive behavior, in which I think it's probably more the latter, in a following way. I don't think he needs anything further to win the Republican primary. He will win the Republican primary by all accounts. And so this could seriously hurt him in the general. I don't think it wins over anybody in the general, and there's a lot of polling that would suggest that it's going to seriously undermine him. The big question I think we'll probably talk about at some point is whether or not this will also potentially be followed by a conviction before the election. Will any of these cases actually get to trial?
Well, that's a good question to follow up. Joyce, is there any chance we can hear you now? All right, well, technology is always your friend, as we're finding out again. Yeah, so let's, Ryan, I'll turn to you again, and then Jeff, you get the big whopper of the Moby Dick of questions coming up. But so what does this calendar look like? What are the chances that that one or more of these cases will be completed, before the Republican convention, and then before the general election?
So I think if we're talking about the cases that have the greatest public importance, then there are two that stand a very good chance of being completed before the election, with one caveat about what I mean by the cases. So the first one is, I do think that we're going to get a full trial in DC from Jack Smith and the Department of Justice prosecuting Donald Trump for trying to overturn the election. And the case is built for speed because, as you mentioned at the outset, and then as Joyce had mentioned, he is the only defendant in the case. There are no co-defendants. It really makes this very efficient. And the judge in the case has indicated she wants to have this come to trial quickly, partly because of what Trump is otherwise doing to pollute the jury pool. But she's that kind of efficient manager of a courtroom, and she set the start date of March 4th. That should happen, and I think that might then mean that we get a conviction in all likelihood in a DC jury. The case is overwhelming, but then there will be appeals, but at least the American public knows that a unanimous jury has potentially convicted the former president for trying to overturn the election. I think that one's big. The second one is, the caveat is, in Georgia, we will get a preview in the sense of, on October 23rd, two of the private lawyers who were working with Trump, Kenneth Chesbrough and Sidney Powell, have demanded a speedy trial, and their trial date starts on October 23rd. And the case involves racketeering and organized crime. There's a very good reason that the district attorney in Georgia will present all of the case or a large part of the evidence that implicates Trump himself, explains to the American public what happened, and the key point being it will be nationally televised. So the Georgia state trial is nationally televised. The federal trials will not be, but I think that will be something that would be super important to American democracy and understanding what happens. That I think will be completed. It'll take several months apparently, but it will be completed before in all likelihood, obviously, before the Republican convention in summer of 2024. And then the classified documents case is scheduled for May, but I don't have as much faith, let's put it that way, in the judge in Florida, Judge Eileen Cannon, and she's already shown various indications that she very well might slow down the case and push it beyond the election.
Right, and she is the jurist in the last 2 years the judge who's shown the most, given people the most reason to believe that she may have a bias. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, Joyce, I know you've got a whole a virtual warehouse of different electronic equipment there because you do so many events. Is this one working?
I sure hope so.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Look, I do want to tell the audience, by the way, do send in those questions. We'll be getting to them momentarily. And of course, we're doing Q&A. Joyce, you share Ryan's view that the January 6th case is incredibly strong. And also, I'm kind of interested in the documents case, which always seemed to me to be, sort of hitting us all in the face as being, well, of course he's guilty. I mean, but do you share the skepticism that the judge there will get it together in time?
So lots of moving parts there, but I'll say my belief is that all 4 of these cases are very strong. And sometimes the New York State case is dismissed, but my belief is that that case too is a strong one. And the facts are shocking. This is a candidate on the eve of a presidential election paying off a porn star so she won't speak out about their relationship in an effort to withhold...
Oh, Joyce, who among us hasn't done
I knew that was
right?
coming.
I mean, didn't you do that? Yeah,
well, I mean,
sure.
you just have no idea how the American Academy in Berlin works, clearly.
You're talking to Joyce, not me, I assume. Yeah.
Okay. But to Jeffrey's point, which I think is a great one, with Trump, because there's so much misconduct, we are quick to blow past some of it and to assign it, categories. Well, this isn't as bad as the other stuff. Well, yeah, this is all really bad. Prosecutors in this country, federal prosecutors under the DOJ's guiding principles called the Federal Principles of Prosecution, may not indict a case unless they believe they have sufficient evidence to obtain a conviction at trial and to sustain it on appeal. These are not thoughtless prosecutions, sort of throw the spaghetti up against the wall and see what sticks. These are cases that prosecutors have taken months, in some cases years to build. I believe that they will all be successful. That's not to say that they don't all come with certain pitfalls, because they do. There are perceptual issues in the New York State case. And as Ryan has pointed out, there are some concerns about the judge in Miami. That's the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. Just about a year ago, the former president filed an extremely unusual lawsuit, something that the Court of Appeals ultimately called unprecedented and stated that there was no legal basis for. Trump tried to prohibit DOJ from using the fruits of the search at Mar-a-Lago in an investigation against him. And let me tell you, I was a prosecutor for 25 years. You just don't get to do that. Under our laws, it's well established that you can challenge a search after you're indicted, but before you go to trial. You can tell the court, hey, we think this search was improper. We'd like to prohibit the government from using anything that they obtained against us. Not what Trump did. He filed a separate civil action, and Judge Cannon, in an opinion that the court above her, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, ultimately said was legally baseless, she was reversed, and it was dramatic. I can't tell you, I practice in this court. I was the appellate chief in my office for many years. This is a court that values civility and collegiality. The strength and the language in this opinion, I think, is absolutely shocking. It suggests that the court had concerns about Judge Cannon, and we may see those come to a head in the not too distant future, because she's got a process in play that involves whether some of Trump's co-defendants might have conflicts of interest. And she appears to be on the verge of making a, I'll say politely, a legally questionable ruling that could find her back in front of the 11th Circuit.
Is there a mechanism for removing her? I mean, can her bosses intervene?
Well, funny that you should ask. No, she doesn't have any bosses. All federal judges are equal here. But I have some experience in this area, and much of the precedent in my circuit, the 11th, for forcing a judge to step aside is from some cases that I handled in a white collar context. If there is an appeal on this attorney conflict of interest question, the United States might suggest to the 11th Circuit that forcing her to recuse would be in order. She has done some very questionable things here. The standard, by the way, is whether the public, an objective member of the public, would have confidence in her ability to handle the case fairly. So it's not an issue of how Trump supporters look at it or how left-wing progressives look at it. It's what is the reasonable person who's well-informed think about Judge Eileen Cannon. I think she might well flunk that standard. And if she does sort of break bad on this issue of conflict, the 11th Circuit might order that she be replaced. Of course, that takes us back to the Washington prosecution, what Ryan and I usually call the January 6th case, where Trump has filed a motion asking the judge up there to recuse herself because of some comments she made in sentencing some of the folks who overran the Capitol on January 6th. I don't think that there's a strong basis for that motion. I would be surprised to see her either agree to recuse or the DC Circuit to force her to recuse. And ultimately, and I think I missed a lot of what Ryan said, but he may have made this point, that case in some ways is ground zero for this matter. To the extent that Americans want to see their rights vindicated and their democracy restored, it's the allegations in that case, which center on the work by a former president to try to hold on to power after losing an election, where a conviction would be the most compelling, the most important for rebuilding our democratic institutions and ensuring the future of the country. Of course, those allegations are repeated in the Fulton County case. I love the fact that that one will be televised. There is no excuse for the federal judiciary's continued refusal to televise proceedings in important cases. So thank you to Georgia for making sure that the American people will get to see at least some of the evidence unfiltered.
That decision is up to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
So there's been long-standing antipathy in the federal courts to introducing cameras. The Federal Judicial Conference, which the Chief Justice leads, could change those rules. They've shown absolutely no willingness to do that. There's actually a pilot program in federal courts, I think more than a decade ago, that was very successful. And at the end of it, federal judges said, thank you, no, we're not willing to subject ourselves to that level of scrutiny. So the Chief Justice, I think, could order it in this particular case. And for those of you who've been following American politics, you know that our Supreme Court is not exactly at a high watermark in American public confidence right now. It would be a smart move, but this is a Supreme Court that seems incapable of taking on the integrity and public confidence issues that it's embroiled in.
Yeah. Jeff, how is America reacting? And you can break that down as you like to, just this staggering amount of activity, illegal activity in pursuit of a former president. I mean,
Dan,
it seems like it's driving polarization in a pretty impressive way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Dan, I haven't spoken to all 340 million Americans, unfortunately.
No one knows their mind better.
I have failed my assignment today in that case. I mean, what's remarkable to me, I'll make a couple of quick points on this. One is that there's this, I don't want to sound too gloomy about this, but there's a remarkable passivity to all of this. I mean, one of the great traits of human beings is that, and one of the great survival traits is that we can adjust to almost anything. And one of the sort of real weaknesses of human beings is that we adjust to anything. And what I am constantly, I mean, I think this goes back to, for me, it goes back to the comments Donald Trump made when he was first running for president about John McCain, right? I thought that was it. Like, I mean, I'm talking about the sort of the commentator class, right? That was it. Like,
You should
all right,
remind everyone what he said.
For those of you who don't remember, he said that, well, I don't think McCain is a hero. I like people who weren't shot down. What's so great about being a POW, et cetera. I mean, you know, you say it even today, 7 years later, almost 8 years later, and it's sort of appalling and also kind of, it's a grotesquerie, obviously, but it's also, well, everybody who knows anything about politics knows that a Republican candidate in particular cannot say that about a war hero and survive. But you know, all of the rules of political physics were upended by Donald Trump, and so, you know, the genius, the inadvertent genius of Donald Trump is that if you say so many outrageous things, people just become inured to it because we get regularized, normalized to it. So right now, you know, there was this brief burst after the first indictment, but especially after the second and third indictments, that oh, well, now the American people will see they don't want to vote for an indicted, somebody who's indicted on criminal charges, or they certainly won't vote for someone who's a convicted felon. And it's like, I just think of it going back to the original McCain rule. It's like, yeah, in the former America, you don't get to run for president successfully, or you don't get to run for a nomination successfully if you're under 91, facing 91 federal criminal charges, right? But the rules don't apply anymore. The country's fixed. I mean, there, you know, what the election is going to come down to, and this is not dissimilar from the last time, but it's even hardened. There's a base of Trump support for whom these indictments only prove the point, right? That the elites are out to get you. Donald Trump is your avatar. And if they get him, they're going to come after you next, right? And so they're every time a conviction will only strengthen him with this group. I mean, obviously, he's a man who could turn a political detriment into a virtue. He sells T-shirts of his mugshot, right, and coffee mugs and so on. So they're fixed. People who the large portion of America loathes him and would never in a million years vote for him. I was going to say that there's three groups, right? And then there's a very small group that's actually kind of in play. There's a fourth group, which is interesting to me, and this is the most interesting. It's the old-fashioned Republicans who are not never Trumpers, but are disgusted by the populism, disgusted by the behaviors, but also like low taxes and also think there's too much wokeness or whatever in American life and so on. And so when push comes to shove, will quietly vote for Donald Trump, maybe deny it to their friends, but will quietly vote for Donald Trump. That's where obviously is some source of strength. Though I have to say, that group plus the hardcore Trump supporters, not necessarily enough to get him over the hump, even in an electoral map that favors the Republicans by 2 or 3 popular points. I mean, I don't want to go into why that is, but America is structurally built for a party that appeals disproportionately to rural people, rural voters to win. But nevertheless, it's going to come down to a very, very small group of people who, I find this hard to believe, but everything is hard to believe, haven't made their minds up whether they like Joe Biden more or Donald Trump more. And that's where it comes down to that same handful of states, including Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and so on. And so none of this, I don't mean to say this, and I don't mean to have this sound Blythe or something, but none of this really matters because most of the people who didn't like Donald Trump before these indictments continue to not like Donald Trump. Most people who liked Donald Trump before the indictments continue to like Donald Trump. It's amazing, obviously I'll finish here, but it's amazing and disconcerting that well-crafted indictments, and by the way, I mean, let's use just the document case in Florida alone. I mean, we got pictures of boxes of documents sitting in bathrooms. It's not like this is an evidence-free, these cases are evidence-free. None of this, for most Americans, none of what's been presented to them in the last several months by a series of prosecutors really matters at all. And I suppose if our country survives, 20, 50, 100 years from now, political scientists and sociologists will explain why this is so. But I don't know the answer.
Let me follow up with
Was that the Moby Dick question?
that was the Moby Dick question, yeah. But now we'll move on to, fishing.
Reasonable size whale. It wasn't a crazily large question.
Yeah, we'll go on to smaller fish now. I'm just curious for all of you, if any of you have a view as to whether or not the actual site or an actual conviction might have a significant political impact, whether there's anything that can crack that kind of rock of certainty that exists in the Republican base or in the middle among those people who Jeff described as, they'll vote for him but hold their noses. I'm just kind of curious if any of the events we're expecting to see in the next year are going to change the political calculus.
Well, I'll take a stab of that because I live in Trump country, Alabama, which voted overwhelmingly for Trump and which will vote overwhelmingly for Trump in 2024, regardless of whether there are any convictions. So to Jeffrey's point, the election comes down to really a handful of people in a number of key states. And so the question that we're really asking is whether any of those people are likely to be influenced by convictions. I'm going to share a quick story about Mississippi politics that might seem unrelated, but that for me increasingly illustrates an important principle about how sui generis, how one-off Donald Trump is. Stuff he gets away with, no other person in American politics could pull off, like his comments about John McCain, continuing today to his efforts to disassemble the FBI, to denounce the head of the Joint Chiefs. These things that would have been unimaginable for any other Republican seem to come to fruition for Trump. Here's the Mississippi story. Mississippi's governor is embroiled in a terrible corruption scandal. It's just absolutely blatant. It's all over the media. His name is Tate Reeves. Republicans have now begun to sport bumper stickers that say, "Later Tater," a reference to voting him out of election in the upcoming office. Democrats are running a moderate candidate. There's a lot of Republican support for him. I mean, this is Mississippi, where Republicans just don't cross party lines, but there are many people who are talking about staying home or even doing the unthinkable, voting for the Democrat because they are so outraged by their governor's corruption. Those same Mississippi Republicans will vote for Donald Trump, whose corruption is at a far more outrageous level, who tried to undermine our democratic institutions. There is something in the American psyche about Donald Trump that permits people to vote for him. It's an interesting question whether that would survive convictions. And here again, I think it's important that in Georgia, a lot of the evidence will be on public display. Although, to be honest, Trump himself probably does not get tried in Georgia in advance of the election. It could happen. The calendar math gets pretty tough with this first case going out in late October and taking 4 months, and other cases already in line. Convictions, though, can change minds. And what I'm reminded of, and this is the last point that I'll make, is a historical one. that Richard Nixon, who was not ultimately tried in court, had strong support from his own party despite his misdeeds until suddenly he didn't. There was a moment that flipped the switch. It was testimony in front of Congress. Here, there's no telling how this might land, whether one witness might say something that breaks through, or whether the cumulative impact of the cases could influence that small segment of voters who will determine the outcome of the election.
Jeff has his skeptical face on.
No, you think about the serial outrages of the last 7 years. I just don't see it. I mean, granted, it was a civil case, but a jury in New York came to the conclusion, and the lawyers here will correct my language, came to the conclusion that he raped someone. Doesn't matter. It doesn't, nothing matter. I mean, I'm sure there's something, but that he could do. But I think the truest thing that Donald Trump ever said, and the most acute piece of political analysis issued by anyone in America in the last 10, 15, 20 years was, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and my supporters won't abandon me. Trump understands this. You put it well. I've already forgotten how you put it, Joyce, but you put it well. There's something in the American psyche that excuses everything that Donald Trump does. And I just don't see any. There's another point. One other point I wanted to make, talking to an international audience. For whatever reason, most in smaller countries, national embarrassment sometimes plays a role in election outcomes. But there are very few voters in America. We're so big. We reach 2 oceans and we're self-absorbed because of that. And we think everybody should speak English just like us, and so on and so on. All these characteristics that people find endearing and maddening about America. We don't seem to care that this is really embarrassing in the world. And obviously that embarrassment has huge consequences for national security, NATO, and our stance and stature and reliability in the Indo-Pacific. But we don't seem to care that this makes us look like an absurd country. The idea that we could have a convicted felon as the nominee, a major party nominee, and a plausible candidate once again for president, doesn't seem to, the fact that it makes us look like a banana republic, and I'm sure you're supposed to say banana republic anymore, but you know what I mean. That doesn't seem to affect the way voters make decisions. I think in some countries that still would have salience as a matter of national pride. Putting up this flim-flam man would be a source of embarrassment to a significantly large proportion that he wouldn't be a legitimate candidate.
Some of us do have those feelings, Jeff, but
but you're in exile. You're living in exile already.
To ask the lawyers, one question that comes up here all the time is, can he actually run from prison? And can he serve from prison? So if you want to take those on, Joyce and Ryan.
Sure. So there's nothing barring an individual who's convicted of a crime or even in prison serving a sentence from running for federal office. So that's not going to stop him legally from running for office. Then the question is, well, let's imagine that he does win back the White House. Then what? So I think the federal cases, both the January 6th case and the classified documents case, go away. They go away at a minimum for 4 years, but they maybe just go away completely because, one, he is the commander-in-chief as well as the chief executive of the Justice Department. He can just quash the Justice Department's cases. And if he even was convicted, but they're appealing it, and there will be appeals, he could just quash their side of the appeal. And as a president, he can issue pardons for himself and others. He can do away with it. I think what people have not focused on, because many think with the Georgia case and the New York case as well, many people think, well, he doesn't have that federal authority in the state context. He can't pardon. The pardon is only for federal crimes, not for state crimes. But I think that's missing an important piece of the puzzle. The piece of the puzzle is the Justice Department, Office of Legal Counsel, has a view of the Constitution. Their view, longstanding for decades, is that a incumbent president is immune from criminal process while they're in office. meaning can't be sentenced, can't spend time in jail, can't be sentenced, can't be tried, can't be indicted, can be investigated. That, in all likelihood, the Supreme Court, I would think, I would place money, would say that is even more the case when we're dealing with state prosecutions by politically elected local prosecutors. So for 4 years, I think they would actually probably suspend whatever position those cases are in, except for two things. One, who does that leave holding the bag? Giuliani and others, all of his co-defendants in Georgia, they will be tried within that 4-year period. I think they should think about that if they're thinking about whether or not to cooperate, because they are otherwise, I think, looking for real prison time in a Fulton County jail. And then the second, so that's the main point of it. And the second is that it would just be a temporary period, but just think about that. Given how we are thinking about or talking about Trump's character, he's in the office of the presidency, and he knows at the end of his term, he's going to face a similar fate. What then happens to our democracy for somebody who obviously doesn't have a deep concern about the Constitution and holding on to power and things like that? So I do worry about the dire implications in that kind of a scenario as well.
Yeah, several of our viewers and I as well have an interest in the question of whether the 14th Amendment is going to wind up being deployed to prevent Donald Trump, from being on the ballot in some states. For those who haven't followed this, there is a clause in the 14th Amendment that bars those who have, correct me if I'm wrong, those who have taken the oath of office from serving if they have supported an insurrection and from taking office again. It was clearly written into the 14th Amendment after the Civil War with the idea of keeping Confederates out of office. And so a number of states, there have been a number of lawsuits. There are states that are thinking this through. What do you all think about this possibility? And I guess to race ahead to the end, is the Supreme Court ever going to let that happen?
I don't think that this is going to happen, because the 14th Amendment, although you can make the argument that it's self-executing just by virtue of the fact that it's there, that someone can say that someone in this situation can't run, I think actually it would require some enabling legislation that would help us understand what the mechanism for excluding someone from the ballot was. I mean, politically, just using it out of the blue here for the first time would probably be enough to start a civil war in this country. There's another problem, though. And look, conservatives tend to be textualists. They think that we should read the Constitution and take it at face value, and you can make a textualist argument for use of the 14th Amendment here. But here's a practical problem that I see. In none of these 4 cases where he's criminally charged has Trump been accused of fomenting insurrection. There are technical elements that prosecutors have to establish to charge someone with insurrection. Prosecutors have done that successfully in some cases in Washington, D.C., involving members of these militia groups. For it to be insurrection, the person has to have had an intent to use violence. And although there's a lot of swirling information in this area, no prosecutor has been so compelled by it that they have charged Donald Trump with insurrection. I think if these cases that are, coming up out of the state courts get to the Supreme Court, that will be a telling decision point for them. I don't see them authorizing the use of the 14th Amendment. It was used successfully in one state, New Mexico, for a state official, but that was because New Mexico actually had procedures for using this and for going after it. So maybe it's a cautionary tale for the future. But above all, we live in a very fragile democracy. I'm a scholar in the area of democratic institutions. I teach and research in that area. It is clear to me that in parts of the country where there is strong support for Trump, a move to take him off of the ballot would likely lead to an eruption of violence. And I will tell you that I do not believe the fact that your followers will erupt in violence is a legitimate reason to not prosecute Donald Trump, to jail Donald Trump if he is convicted, and to exert the full pressure of the law against him. But I think by the same token, we must be very careful about doing anything that crosses that line and is overboard, and it could be perceived by people really across the spectrum as being an unfair move designed to kneecap Trump. Better to let the voters make that decision at the polls.
Everyone agree? Jeff, you're muted.
No, I just been thinking about this a lot recently. Maybe this sounds fatalistic, but maybe it's just realistic. It's, if this is who the people of America want to be president, and if enough people who want this man to be president can figure out a way to get him to be president legally, I don't know. I mean, that's who we are then. You know, it goes to this discourse of, this is not who we are. We are not a country that would have this kind of person be well, maybe we are. I mean, I don't mean to sound fatalist. I agree with the analysis that removing someone from creating conditions for what make it impossible for this man to run, when obviously millions and millions of people want him to run, that would be a recipe for a kind of disaster. And I'm willing to risk, I don't want to be blackmailed by people who say, unless you would allow this, then violence will happen. But there's a point at which this runs directly into the idea that, well, if tens of millions of my fellow citizens want this guy, you know, we're going to get out of this situation that we're in, this fragility of democracy. We're going to get out of it the hard way or the easy way. Maybe we're going the hard way.
But, you know, that's the fundamental bargain that we make as Americans. We agree to abide by the decision of the majority. Our system is imperfect, and the Electoral College is obviously a flawed system. But the reality here is, I have confidence in Americans. I have concerns about our electoral system. I think we're going to all have to be vigilant to make sure that every American can register, can vote, and can have their vote counted. There are obviously weaknesses in the system, but perhaps there's a silver lining in that this is a moment where average, everyday Americans, what the times demand of them is that they stand up and take the educational process that we use before we decide to vote seriously this go round, that they vote for candidates, that they work at polling places despite any kinds of threats, and that they make the system work. I am reminded in the 1980s, I went to school in Germany. It was a language program. There were people from across Europe, and I had an awakening moment when some of my Polish classmates, you know, we were having a conversation about democracy, and I said, oh, our system is so great. We vote, we get to pick. And they pointed to the ongoing election at that point in time and to the two presidential candidates. And they said, you know, that's not really much of a choice. I mean, Republicans, Democrats, they just about stand for the same thing. That was true back in the 1980s. It is not true in this election. There could be no starker choice than Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And so it's a real moment for Americans to decide who they are. It's a real tender moment, but it is a moment where we have the chance to say we are not Donald Trump. And I know the world is waiting largely to see if we have the gumption and if we have what it takes to do that.
Let me ask another question about how we get out of this mess. And this is one that I encounter a lot here in Germany, which is there some road to a grand bargain in which the charges are dropped and Trump in return for Trump not running? These are I've never heard of anything like this happening in the American system, but I'd be curious if, given this unprecedented situation we're in, there is some possibility that something like that could come to pass.
So it actually is built in a certain sense to the justice system that there is this off-ramp. And in fact, it's even in the Justice Department's internal manual for how prosecutors might handle a situation of a plea agreement with a political office, somebody in political office. And I believe this is also was part of the agreement with Nixon's vice president in a kind of a high stakes case historically. They wouldn't
with
Spiro Agnew. Yeah. So there's even that kind of historical precedent at that level. But I don't think that's going to happen here. First, I don't think Trump in any shape or form is going to admit to guilt and then try to strike a plea. Second, I think the Justice Department would never want to enter into the conversation with him about it because it could just easily be a ruse in which he even tries to introduce the idea and then say, see, this is what it's all about, trying to keep me away from the White House and off the ballot. So kind of dovetailing with what we just discussed with the 14th Amendment in a certain way. And it's interesting because there's even one of the provisions of the classified documents case would actually disqualify somebody from office. That one has constitutional concerns. And it might have even been one of the reasons, I think, why the Justice Department may have shied away from the insurrection charge, potentially, in the January 6th case, because it would actually come with a penalty of barring a person from office, and they don't want any appearance that that's what this is about. What it is about the application of the criminal law to the facts. So I don't think that that's something realistic in a certain sense.
So let me just drill down on that for one sec. You think that one of the reasons they didn't choose to use the insurrection, to prosecute him under the Insurrection Act, was because it would look too much like they were trying to take him out of presidential contention, which I find fascinating. And to sort of turn it into a question, one of the amazing things, or to me, one of the surprising things about the January 6th case indictment is that it really doesn't lay much blame on him for the storming of the Capitol, which for most of us was about the most traumatic event in our civic life, or most of in living memory, and for those who remember it, since perhaps the Kennedy assassination.
Yes, I always wondered and thought about the question of whether or not he'd be charged for those acts, because those are the very acts that people associate with January 6th and trying to overturn the election, what they saw on their TV screens. It is in the indictment, but it's not charged as such. It's not charged as incitement of the riots or the like. There's also a reference earlier in the indictment where it does say that Donald Trump sent people to the Capitol to obstruct the certification. So there's a bit of a tie-in, and it could be presented at trial in a more powerful way. I'm very curious to see what Joyce thinks about this. I would speculate that Jack Smith inherited a case file that was highly incomplete because they got started late. They were jump-started by the January 6th Select Committee, and they had to pull things together because he does want a speedy trial. I'm not sure that they have connected all of the dots when it comes to whether or not Donald Trump was responsible for the act of violence with somebody like an intermediary like Roger Stone. There are other indications.
Roger Stone, long-time Trump associate and the master of dirty tricks in American politics.
And very closely associated with the Proud Boys. He has sworn a form of an oath to the Proud Boys, had oath keepers as bodyguards on the day of January 6th.
Yeah. And
there was, just to throw another one out, there was an encrypted chat message group called Friends of Stone that included the head of the Proud Boys, the head of the Oath Keepers, Roger Stone, and they communicated with each other on January 6th. Map this out as something that they might really be something there. But I wonder if Jack Smith I think he had to go at a certain point, and I'm not sure as to whether or not the Justice Department has followed that all the way through to the end. I guess I'll just leave it.
Ryan wanted your opinion.
Yeah, so federal prosecutors are required to charge the most readily provable serious crime that they can based upon the evidence that they have. I believe that if Jack Smith had had evidence to support an insurrection charge, he would have brought that charge. Ryan makes a really important point here, which is that the Justice Department appeared to be asleep at the switch for the first year after the Biden administration took over. And we don't really know what's going on. Was there a lack of willingness inside of the department to prosecute? Was there perhaps a mistaken perception that Trump would just go away and be less dangerous if they let it die down? We don't know. What we do know is that about a year in, Merrick Garland gave a speech where he committed that everyone involved in January 6th, no matter whether they were there that day or not, would get a good hard look from investigators. And then ultimately Jack Smith indicts. And I guess the question is, did he just not have enough time? Was he stymied by that lapse in the first year? Or is there really not evidence that Donald Trump intended the use of force? I think it's something that we don't know right now. There's a lot of not even circumstantial evidence, but there's enough for us to say that it's not unreasonable to suppose that there might be witnesses out there who would say Trump didn't interfere because he wanted that violence to succeed. But Trump has been remarkably successful in keeping key people from cooperating with prosecutors. It is completely inexplicable to me, but very clear that his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, is not cooperating with prosecutors, that if anything, he is the most hostile of hostile witnesses. He will tell as much of the truth as he has to save his own skin, but it's clear that he has not talked with prosecutors about Trump's need for violence, desire for violence. And look, they have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, both to get a conviction and to have it sustained on appeal. No evidence, no indictment. It's just that simple.
We have seen a number of people, Mark Meadows not included, who have flipped and gone from being uncooperative to cooperative. And in some way, it seems like the fact that you have the Georgia case with lots of people facing legal peril, and you have the Washington case with only Trump facing legal peril, is kind of a good recipe for getting lots of people to decide that they don't want to spend time in a state prison. Are you expecting that there will be more flipping? I mean, I'm still kind of astonished that former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani hasn't cut a deal, because he's going to be living on the street soon.
As a prosecutor, I'm not very interested in Rudy Giuliani's cooperation. He's lied so much. He's so tarnished. I'm not sure that I can sort of resurrect his reputation enough to put him on the witness stand in good faith. You can't put on a witness who you believe is lying. And Giuliani is a long, sad story. There are other witnesses, and particularly some of the lawyers, who you would think would have decided months ago to cut their losses and cooperate. So far, none of them have. And of course, with the early trial in Georgia, we have the prospect that at least two of the lawyers, including Sidney Powell, who was the one who, got made a lot of fun of for saying release the crack and that sort of stuff. Our legal strategy is the Kraken legal strategy. These folks who were intimately involved with the president at key time periods, they possibly could cut deals and cooperate, but there's always that balance between who's willing and what does that willing person have to offer me as a prosecutor. Am I willing to give them a deal for what they can competently testify to?
Jeff, turning again to the political side of things, we have, I share your view that the continued support for someone facing 91 charges of so much of the country is a deeply depressing fact. At the same time, do you think that the Trump's opponents in the country, or those who don't want to see him in office, have been heartened by the fact that the legal system seems to be in motion, that we can again think of ourselves as a country that lives under the rule of law, and that our democracy is not perhaps quite as imperiled as we might have worried?
Well, heartened, yes, but also frightened, because we know because the Trump team has said so and have made plans for this. We know that Trump 2, the second term, let's call it the second phase of Trump's interrupted 8-year presidency, should it come to pass, is going to be nothing like Trump won. And so you could see, I don't want to actually call the Justice Department robust in this case, because Merrick Garland probably waited a lot too long. Put those issues aside, but you see a justice system at work in a high level, competent, coherent way. But I think many people who care about this are looking with a great deal of trepidation and knowing that this could be the last gasp of an independent Justice Department, because Trump has said, I mean, he said, "I am your retribution" to his followers. What he means by that is that, no more. He's not coming into office with people like Jim Mattis and John Kelly and H.R. McMaster and all, Rex Tillerson, all the rest. It's going to be Stephen Miller's all the way down. And so the thing to, you could take some heart in the fact that Donald Trump did not succeed in breaking American institutions. But we also know that his goal is to break American institutions.
So thank you for that uplifting note. So let me just add one gloss on that I hope will keep people from, rushing to the nearest kitchen drawer to find their knives. Which is that, Trump failed at so much that he wanted to do in the first administration because of his incompetence and the incompetence of a lot of people who he brought with them. I am not looking forward to second term much as you aren't, but I still wonder if anyone could bring in, or if Donald Trump could bring in such a capable team to accomplish the dismantling of the federal bureaucracy and the Justice Department in the way that he's threatened. I don't want to find out, but I just want to cast a little doubt on his ability to do it all.
But Dan, they literally are sitting at Heritage Foundation writing long plans, action plans for the removal of the civil service and key. I was going to use a covering the developing world coups in the power ministries, in seizing the key ministries of American government. And if they can convince Trump, they meaning the Stephen Miller coterie there, can convince Trump that his goal is to set North Star direction and let us carry this out. And obviously it depends on who controls Congress to some degree. But I think they're starting from the get. They're not going to make the poorly planned out overreaches like the quote unquote Muslim ban that they tried to initiate early on in the first administration. They're writing plans. They're sharing these plans. It's not a secret. And yes, Trump was undone to some degree by his greed, by his lack of planning, foresight, understanding that he has no learning curve, and so on and so on. But really what held him back was a system that bent but didn't break. And until the very last days, he had Bill Barr there, and Bill Barr, sitting in the AG's office, did push back against some of the craziest stuff. There's not going to be a Bill Barr the next time. Don't count on anything, is what I'm saying.
I don't want to get in trouble with my former think tank colleagues in Washington, but maybe you have more respect for Heritage product than I do. But anyway.
I'm not saying that it's an intellectually coherent or moral product. I'm saying it's an effective product.
Well, we should close. I want to thank everyone here for really some brilliant insights, but I want to ask Ryan and Joyce, before we close, how you're feeling about the American system of justice and the Justice Department in particular, and the judges and the enormous number of people involved in the current efforts. I'm curious if this has caused you to reassess the system that your lives are very much entwined with.
So I guess in some sense, it has restored my faith in the system that we have a special counsel who is able to have the running room to prosecute a case and has brought some highly formidable cases. And then to see the one in Fulton County by Bonnie Willis, I also think is a very formidable case as well. It's very well done, and a lot of the briefs that she's been filing in state and federal court are very, very well done. So that's, in a certain sense, restored my faith in many respects. And I'll even add to that, this is highly controversial in a way, which to end this, but I even think that a justice system that ends with that has resulted in the indictment of the sitting head of state's son also demonstrates the independence of the justice system in our country and the rule of law in some sense. There's another argument against that, which is that resulted from a lot of political pressure, one might say, but I kind of look at that a different way. I just want to end on one other point, just because I didn't come in earlier in the conversation. There is some political survey data that gives me greater faith in the American people on the question of whether, if Trump is convicted of any of these crimes, it will affect what they think about who should lead the country. YouGov did a poll, for example, in the summer. Question: if Donald Trump is convicted of a serious crime, do you think he should be allowed to serve as president again in the future? Republicans, 39% no. Independents, 63% no. Now, that's maybe them projecting their future selves or thinking about what their identity is, but they don't actually act on it later. But that's still important, and I think an important variable, especially with what Joyce said, when we're coming down to it's about 5 or so purple states and then the independents in the middle and the others in the middle as to which way they go. I think that might be important about the relationship between our justice system and our democracy.
Joyce?
You know, some smart person coined the phrase that democracy is an absolutely terrible system of government, but it's the best one known to mankind. I see a certain sort of application for that mentality to what we're now learning about the resiliency of our legal system and our criminal justice system. It is not imperfect, or rather, it is not perfect. It is largely aspirational in many ways, and no one has stress tested it like Donald Trump has. I think what we're seeing is the suggestion that the system is good enough. Look, there are a lot of challenges ahead. We have a history that's beyond the scope of today's conversation of racial injustice that permeates our criminal justice system. But leaving that aside for the moment, when it comes down to holding a political miscreant accountable, our system has shown that it can take some hits and still come back. But we don't know how that story ends yet. And there are questions of timing. Can this be done in time? And can the system actually hold Trump accountable? Those questions still have to be answered. I remain very optimistic.
Well, the American Academy is always in favor of optimism. So thank you for that. Even if some of its trustees are determined to find the dark lining in every silver cloud. Anyway, it's been wonderful.
You guys, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that everything holds, and I hope you're right. But, you know, as someone who worked as a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, I remember what lake it's located on. That's all I'm saying. I'll leave it at that.
You had to go there, didn't you?
I'm going there. I'm going there because I'm worried about this. I'm worried about our country. Well,
Jeff, just so you know, worst comes to worst, we're clearing out part of the bottom floor for the editorial staff of The Atlantic.
The Atlantic in exile.
Yeah. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us. I'll deal with Jeff later. Okay. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.